Hey everybody, I'm back. Well, I never really left, but I'm still here. And we are uh, here for our third video workshop. And I hope that um, you feel like we made it through our first module on writing personal narratives, um, certainly without too many scars, but most importantly, I like to say, walking out of a module, that you have a couple more ideas about how narratives work and how narrative communication functions. And I say narrative communication because, you know, probably most of us are not going to go on to become fiction writers or short story writers. Some of us will certainly have to use narrative writing in our various professions. But more than anything, we all communicate narratively. And so, yeah, it might not be as technical as trying to develop effective takeaways and develop these sort of foreshadowing setups and using alliteration or what have you. But understanding, having those things kind of in the back of your mind or in your back pocket, that people want to be involved, people want things to imagine when you're telling a story. People want things to they want to have a sense of emotional impact. They want to have a takeaway from a story. So those are things that are good to have in mind. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. This video workshop, we're going to be talking about documentary films. And, well, what exactly is a documentary film? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get right to it to try and keep this as short as possible. Um, Sorry, always takes me a second or two. There we go. Okay, see if I can make this full screen. All right, we should be good to go. Like I said, by now we should have read the M2 overview, and you are aware that for our next module, we're doing something quite different from writing personal narratives. In fact, we're done with narratives. And maybe that sounds good at this point, at least as far as writing our own narratives. Uh, our next two essays are going to involve critical analysis. Our third essay, um, which is called Glitches for Progress, our third module, is going to be more research heavy and research based. For this second module, as you should know by now, we're going to be analyzing a documentary film or series of our own choice. Documentaries are something, you can just see a few here that have been quite popular in the recent past, or recently, I should say. Documentaries are something that are abundant. As we saw in the M2 overview, it's this time, our current time, is considered a kind of golden age for documentaries. Um, and so you can see that we have the prompt here about straight from the second module that says, for our second module, M2 Unreal Truths, we will select a documentary and analyze how its specific representation of the reality of a social issue, effectively or not, allows for us to critically engage with that issue. Now, anytime we get a prompt like that, you're going to want to kind of dissect it, and so as to better understand it. So, first thing is, the prompt is always telling us to do multiple things, and in many ways, it's asking us multiple questions. But one thing to notice is that, right, for our second module, we will select one of our first jobs is to select a documentary film. And then once I've selected it, I'm going to analyze it, right? And I'm going to think about and make an argument about whether or not I think it effectively gets us to critically engage with that issue. So this raises a lot of other questions as well. What is a documentary film? What do we mean by a representation of reality? What do we mean by social issue? What do we mean by critically engaging with that issue? So over the next couple weeks, hopefully all of these sort of questions within the prompt, if you will, we can start to answer. In the case of this particular video workshop, we're really going to be focusing in on understanding how to select a documentary, meaning I've given you in the N2 overview a list of different links to find documentaries that are out there in the public sphere. I'm sure many of you have seen documentaries, and a number of you are quite familiar with documentaries, and you're obviously welcome to write about any documentary you like. But the other thing that we're really going to focus in on here is, what is a documentary? How do we distinguish it from, well, what? A fiction film? And then what do we mean by representation of reality? We'll touch a little bit upon that. We'll also touch a little bit upon social issues. For the most part, we're thinking about what a documentary is, so we can understand how to select one that we think will be effective for our analysis or our argument. So documentaries are something, like I said, that are quite popular. I just did a quick search for documentaries today. This is a screenshot of my search on Netflix for documentaries. And you can see that it brings up, I mean, I didn't even scroll here. I just took the screenshot of what came up on top. Of course, they're going to put their most recent. Netflix has its own production department related to documentaries. So it's going to put its own, obviously, they're all its own documentaries, but they're also going to put the most recently added documentaries usually towards the top. But even looking at the documentaries that are out there, documentaries stretch, run the gamut as far as social issues are concerned. Whether they're documentaries about, crime, the prison system, and the justice system, whether they're about physical and mental health, about historical events, nature and the environment, cultural icons, the food industry, and that's just looking at this one page. We see that documentaries are things that go, like I said, run the gamut as far as social issues. So one way to select a documentary, if you don't really have any, one in mind already, or something that you've seen that you thought was really poignant or powerful or impactful or intriguing, you might go by social issue. Let's say you're really interested in nature and the environment. Then you could sort of seek out a documentary. There's many of documentaries about the natural world and the environment. Maybe you're really interested in crime and prison and the justice system. Then maybe you want to follow that route. So the social issue can be the other way, and I talk about this in the N2 overview, can be the other way that we go find a documentary. But I think you're going to have, it's not going to be a problem of a lack of documentaries that are out there. There are, I mean, hundreds of thousands of documentaries that have been made. And all your regular streaming services, whether it's Netflix or Hulu or Max or whatever it might be, Apple TV or whatever it might be, have documentaries. There's tons of free documentaries online as well. So we're living in this golden age of documentaries. But the next questions is that is sort of begged of us, and I quoted from the film scholar Heinrich Juhl, I think is how you pronounce his name. Forgive me, Heinrich. But he says that we seem to quite well and instantaneously, we seem to know quite well and instantaneously a documentary when we see it. So a couple of questions that you'll see down below are, why is this? How do we know a documentary when we see it? What is this film scholar Heinrich Juhl talking about? What does he mean by that? Is there a difference? And I think most of us would say we feel like there is when we watch a movie like Saving Private Ryan, which is not a documentary, as opposed to a movie like Fahrenheit 9/11 or a movie like Restrepo. Chances are you've heard of Saving Private Ryan. It's a Hollywood film, right? It has these A-list stars who are in it. Films like Restrepo, Fahrenheit 9/11 are less popular. These films are essentially about war. Restrepo is a documentary about fighting in the Afghanistan war and the Kandahar Valley, I think. And Fahrenheit 9/11 is about the Iraq war and the kind of political global politics behind the precipitation of that war, and of course behind 9/11 as an event. So how do we know? I mean, how do we know the difference between a documentary? What does a documentary do? I mean, sure, we might instinctually know it, but what are the actual differences between a documentary and a fiction film. This gets a little bit more complicated in the fact that recently, relatively recently, a new genre has popped up. If you look at these three films here, the Central Park Five is a documentary about five kids of color who were arrested in Central Park for they were wrongly accused and imprisoned. Um, in much case, due to, if you watch the documentary, it is argued due to the fact of this racist media bias and racial bias within our justice system. Then you have When They See Us, which is a dramatic retelling of the Central Park Five story using actors um, playing the different kids. You can see images of the five kids there on the movie poster. It's the same story, if you will, about the same event, but it's different, right? We have actors here. Also, you've probably heard of the film or series Dahmer, most recently, which of course is the story or one version of the story of the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. So I remember when Dahmer came out, and a lot of my students were like, "Well, Professor Reed, Dahmer is real," referring to the film, and I said it's not real. Um, in fact, no film, not even the Central Park Five documentary, I would argue, is quote unquote fact or real. And we'll get into that. I don't want to make us sort of get too weird right away, but it's just an interesting question. What is a documentary when we live in this age of this new genre that's come out called docudrama? Now, you noticed in the M2 overview, I say that you're welcome to write about a docudrama. If you're really interested in thinking about what the impact is upon When They See Us or something like Dahmer, Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, you can absolutely write about those things, but there's a particular approach you're going to want to take, which is what are some of the challenges, some of the problems, or even some of the positives of approaching a real life event in a more dramatic than documentary approach. So you are welcome to pursue a docudrama, but please reach out to me and have conversations with me, and I'm happy to sort of help you with how we can navigate that. So I'm going to take us in a little bit of a strange direction, probably no surprise at this point. This is a painting, in order to get us in a kind of frame of mind to think about what a documentary is. Some of you may know this painting. It's a painting by Rene Magritte, the artist, and some of you may even speak French. And if you do, you know that the little sentence there on the bottom says, "This is not a pipe," right? This painting stirred up all kinds of controversy. I mean, it doesn't seem like such a thing would do so, but it's a painting that came out in 1929, and Rene Magritte called it the treachery of images. So the fact that he puts here, "This is not a pipe," begs the question of us as the audience, well, then what is it? It looks like a pipe, but of course it's not a pipe. And the most simple answer is that, well, this is a painting. It's a painting of a pipe. It's not an actual pipe. So the fact that he calls this the treachery of images points to the fact that we often take representations as real, right? We don't second guess, at least, we suspend our disbelief. Similarly, Joseph Kosuth, another artist from the 60s and 70s, did an installation piece called One and Three Chairs, where he sort of has a real life, if you will, chair. He has up on the upper right, it's hard to see the text there, but that's a plaque that shows, or a canvas that has painted on it, the dictionary definition of a chair, and then he has a photograph of the same chair. And again, the idea here is to get us to think about representation, right? To have some sort of, it's sort of complicating the notion of truth, because I think we most often think of documentary films as being true, right? Just like I said, a lot of my students, when the Dahmer monster thing, they say, well, it's real, it's true. And I said, no, it's not. I guess we could say it's based on true events, but it's not real. It is not true, if you will. So all of this to sort of get us to think about documentaries a little bit more in depth than just, well, documentaries are things that are based upon truth. They're true. Because I think that leaves a lot for us still to think about in order to effectively analyze them. One issue is that film is based in derealization, and arguably all art is based in derealization. Butler and Palesh, who I believe are neuroscientists who also write about or think about film, say film is unique in its ability to mimic dissociative states, especially derealization. In derealization, the world appears unreal or hyperreal. Time speeds up or slows down, objects appear closer or more distant, colors intensify or dull. Sorry, I got to move the captions here. Objects appear closer or more distant, colors intensify or dull, and sounds become selectively amplified or muted, all of which are common effects in film. So, film, we like to think of a film of something capturing the reality of that thing. But just by filming something, we're framing it, we're disconnecting it from its place in the world, we're decontextualizing it from that place in the world and from time. We're focusing on certain things, we're selecting certain things, we're generalizing, we're archetyping. There's all these ways in which just by filming something that we are derealizing it. And of course, this makes sense because film is a representation. It's the representation of an event, the representation of an event. And this seems obvious, but particularly it makes even more sense if we think about our contemporary lives. We live in a world of derealization, whether we're talking about, I mean, much less just photographs, but the fact that photos can be so filtered, altered, touched up, and even completely invented from scratch using artificial intelligence or image generators or what have you. We're very used to this derealization. So, if this kind of barometer of truth, if you will, as far as what a documentary film is, uh, doesn't hold weight, then how can we sort of like distinguish between documentaries, right? If documentaries are films too, they do the same derealization. Saving Private Ryan or Fahrenheit 9/11 arguably does the same derealization as Saving Private Ryan does. So how can we distinguish between fiction and documentary film? And of course, the point of doing this is so we can better understand what documentary films are, so we can understand their purpose and how we can analyze them more effectively. So one thing we could say about documentary films, it's going to take a few different definitions, I think, is that they are about real people and real events. Documentaries are always about real people and real events, I think is something we can safely say. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines a documentary as a movie, television show, or radio program that provides a factual record or report. But I wanted to beg the question, how might this be incorrect? And so that's one of the questions we have in this video workshop. But a mechanical type of recording and displaying video does not make one a documentary filmmaker. We need to see some point of view, a message of some sort, a moral or ideological ambition with the film made. In short, a wish to make a difference, to change the world, or at least the way in which some relevant audience will look upon the world or themselves. So, okay, documentary films, that's one thing that we could say that documentary films are, is that they are about real people and real events. But then again, if we go back, Saving Private Ryan, of course, is about real people and real events. In fact, as I pointed out in the M2 overview, most of the Best Picture nominations in recent memory have been based on true stories. And arguably, documentaries, of course, are always based on true stories, and many times fiction films are based on true stories. So while they are about real people and real events is one criteria, we're going to need to go a little bit further to understand how to distinguish or what makes documentary films different from fiction films. One thing is that they tend to be investigative and have an activist purpose or an intent to expose an unknown or lesser known reality, right? So they have a kind of journalistic aspect to them, documentary films do. And this is a quote that is in the M2 overview again. Because investigative journalism has been cut in American media, documentary filmmakers readily take on the duty of going out and pursuing deep investigations. Documentaries don't simply register events and circumstances, but find the most moving examples of social problems so as to expose a reality less known and motivate an audience towards social change. So there's another definition of not only it's not just about facts and real people and real events. It's also about the message. It's about a point of view. It's about exposing a lesser known reality as well as motivating an audience. And that's what I mean by that activist purpose. You know, what is Saving Private Ryan motivating us to do? Is it motivating us to question war and its worth? Maybe not. You could probably argue that Saving Private Ryan actually is kind of a celebration, a romanticization of war. Of course, you can make whatever argument you would like, but so that's another thing that I think helps us understand what documentaries do that's different from fiction films. A third thing is that they are argumentative. I think it's a good way to think about a documentary as a kind of argument. So, strangely enough, since we're analyzing a documentary for this second module, sorry, for the second module, we are analyzing an argument. Does the argument of this documentary work? Is it effective? So, there's another quote. I've always subscribed to the idea that documentaries work best when treated as arguments rather than statements. I don't go to documentaries to be informed of the raw facts. I go because I want to be convinced. It's a chance to look at how a filmmaker sees a particular event and see whether it lines up with the version I might have expected. Documentaries are trying to convey a sense of what happened as seen through a particular viewpoint. So again, we have that point of view, but I like this idea of argument. And I think that is another characteristic particular to documentary films as compared to fiction films. Fourth thing, they're not objective fact, but have a primary goal of truth over entertainment. So it's not that documentaries, sorry about that, not that documentaries don't want to be entertaining. Sure, they do. I mean, I think any filmmaker wants to try and make their money back. But documentary filmmakers have this, I think, before entertainment, their goal is truth or that kind of activist purpose. So the documentarian isn't just objectively capturing what happened. If they did, they wouldn't edit footage and interviews. They're produced with a purpose of presenting a truth, whereas fiction films are in pursuit of the art of storytelling and entertainment. Fiction films ask us for a suspension of disbelief. In other words, not to concern ourselves with accuracy, right? Whereas documentaries, right, they want us to actually question our realities, question what is commonly known about a situation or event or a social issue, and they have a purpose that, again, that connects to that kind of activism, connects to that idea of the investigative. They don't want us to suspend our disbelief. They want to try and find the truth and present us the evidence, if you will, to find that truth. So going back to that question, but documentaries are films too. So how can we distinguish between fiction and documentary film and bringing back those two original artworks? I think it's important that we pay attention to what Magritte and Kossuth titled their artworks, right? They very purposefully title them as a way to get us to question what we understand films to be, right? They automatically say, here, this is one version of this reality, okay? This is, keep in mind that this is just one version and try and see through it for yourself. Find your own truth through the material I'm presenting to you. So it's interesting that the titles of these paintings aren't trying to just mimic right? They're trying to get us to question our reality. And I think that's something that documentaries do. So there's something about the intent, the purpose, and the relationship to truth that makes documentaries different from fiction films, um, whose primary goal is to entertain. Um, this raises the question then, and I talk a little bit about this in our M2 overview, what is our current context regarding truth? Since we're going to, as we will see, going to want to make arguments that are, they have significance, right? That they have relevance for our time, for people who are going to be reading your arguments and analyses, it's good to think about the context of our society. So in 2016, Oxford Dictionaries proclaimed post-truth their word of the year, a term or similar terms that I suspect we have heard frequently and recently. But what does post-truth mean? What does post-truth mean to you? And this is one of the questions that will be below. If the fact that we live in a post-truth age, now, as I said in my in the M2 overview, this sort of implies that maybe one of the reasons that we live in a golden age of documentary is that people are hungering for films that are true, that are about the real. But I thought these are a couple of interesting quotes. Trump has discovered something about epistemology in the 21st century. The truth may be real, but falsehood often works better. And then Oxford describes post-truth as, quote, denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So a couple other questions. Does post-truth mean that truth doesn't exist? What has made our society a post-truth society? Where does this come from? So those are some questions for discussion that'll also obviously be below. Further details around context is that media research found that 45% of Americans get their news from Facebook, and identified that about 65 million Americans consume fake news during the 2016 election period. Thus, everyone interested in facts and truth are justified in considering ways in which we all can combat the negative impact of fake news, not only on our democracy, but also on all ways of life. How do we define truth? How do you individually define truth? And how can we find these truths? Therefore, are questions that are important to our ways of life, to social issues, to democracy. And in that case, we can start to see, and we'll talk more about this later, how our arguments have a larger context. Our analysis of a documentary and its pursuit of truth has a larger significance. So what is the difference between fact and truth? I think this kind of goes back to the kind of emotional truth or authenticity we talked about in the narrative module. And I wanted to bring in a few excerpts from Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried. He has a short story in there called How to Tell a True War Story. And of course, he's talking about specifically war stories, but I think it teaches us something perhaps related to documentaries. So I'm going to read through this, pull some of the points out, and show how I think they relate to notions of truth or presentations or representations of truth. In many cases, a true war story cannot be believed. If you believe it, be skeptical. It's a question of credibility. Often the crazy stuff is true and the normal stuff isn't, because the normal stuff is necessary to make you believe the truly incredible craziness. For example, we've all heard this one. 4 guys go down a trail, a grenade sails out, one guy jumps on it and takes the blast and saves his buddies. Is it true? The answer matters. You'd feel cheated if it never happened. Without the grounding in reality, it's just a trite bit of puffery, pure Hollywood, untrue in the way all such stories are untrue. Yet even if it did happen, and maybe it did, anything's possible, even when you know it can't be true, because a true war story does not depend upon that kind of truth. Happeningness is irrelevant. A thing may happen and be a total lie. Another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth. For example, 4 guys go down a trail, a grenade sails out, one guy jumps on it and takes the blast, but it's a killer grenade and everybody dies anyway. Before they die, though, one of the dead guys says, "The fuck you do that for?" And the jumper says, "Story of my life, man. and the other guy starts to smile, but he's dead. That's a true story that never happened. And I think what Tim O'Brien is driving at here is this idea of something ringing true, feeling true, the idea of speaking truth, true that, right? Those moments where the truth seems to come through, even in the case of something that's fiction, uh, or let's say a documentary film. Tim O'Brien goes on, and I think this is where we can pull some of these kind of bullet points out. Again, he's talking about war stories, but I think we can relate it to documentaries, right? A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing things they have always done. A story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old, terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. True war stories do not generalize. They do not indulge in abstraction or analysis. For example, war is hell. As a moral declaration, the old truism seems perfectly true, and yet because it abstracts, because it generalizes, I can't believe it with my stomach. Nothing turns inside. It comes down to gut instinct. A true war story, if truly told, makes the stomach believe. So if we pull things out of this, and we're stretching a little bit to try and relate this to documentaries and what documentaries do, true stories, at least according to Tim O'Brien, especially war stories, right? But true stories, let's try and stretch this. They should not moralize, right? They should leave room for the audience. So let's say documentaries should not moralize. It's not to say that some documentaries do moralize. Certainly they do. We talked about point of view, but I think Tim O'Brien's talking about something different than a point of view. By moralization, he's talking about they shouldn't tell you what to think, right? They shouldn't be propaganda. They should be open to interpretation, right? At least to some extent. Excuse me. They also shouldn't have no easy resolution or happy ending, right? Documentaries should leave you asking questions. They should leave you to want to. They should be motivating you to know more, um, um, rather than just sort of leaving you satisfied. So I think that's a real interesting idea, and the way we can think about the ending of our documentaries, or how do they leave you off? They should not generalize, right? They should not simplify. Everything is contextual. Truth is something that is contextual. It is something that is part of particular circumstances, particular moments. It is not something, there isn't just one truth that covers every single situation. Even in the case of a single social issue, there's so many different stories and so many different truths of domestic violence, and so many different stories and so many different truths of, say, corporate corruption. So it should not generalize. It should not be abstract. It should be visceral. Excuse me. It should be visceral. It should be human. Right? It talks about wanting to feel it in the gut. For me, this means that documentaries should connect to us emotionally. They shouldn't just simply be these kind of cold, you know, um, history books. It should be, or these kind of book reports, right? They should be visceral. They should be human. They should, at the same time, connect with us emotionally, so that we care, so that we're motivated to care. And in this sense, as Tim O'Brien says, documentaries shouldn't just be about facts, or they're not just about facts. They're about this other idea of truth, or an idea of reality. So with that in hand, I think rather than truth, what we're talking about is a kind of realism. And I think there's many kinds of truths that make up that realism. The documentaries can strive for an emotional truth, things that connect, telling a story that connects with our humanity and our reality, which is pathos, right? This is the rhetorical triangle, if you will. Also, an intellectual truth. Documentaries should be revelatory. We should be learning something. They should be educational. They shouldn't be telling us what we already know. And that goes back to that idea of investigative and journalistic in their approach. And they should also be grounded in reality. They need to be based on real events, real people, and be specific, not generalized or abstracted, right? Cornell West, the philosopher Cornell West, has a definition that I believe he sort of adopted or borrowed um, from Hegel. But regardless, the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And I felt like that really sort of connected with what documentaries at their best can do, which is they can allow a truth, or they can allow an unseen or lesser known part of the world speak and be shown and be known and be heard. And so that at their best, I think, is what documentaries can do. All right, I'm going to end it there in the spirit of time. I hope that, well, perhaps quite complicates what documentaries are, but at the same time, I hope it kind of gives us a sense of kind of how documentaries have a purpose. Um, they have these roles to play, a kind of activist purpose, and that helps us better understand how we can start to analyze them and whether or not they're achieving those purposes and how they're impacting their audience. So as we go forward, we're going to be talking about how do we analyze, of course, documentaries, but also how do we make arguments out of these analyses. We obviously social issues, that kind of context and the significance, those things are going to play a role. But in the meantime, when you're selecting your documentary, you might want to keep these things in mind, not just to help you understand what's the difference between fiction film and a documentary. And you can always reach out to me if you want to make sure that something is a documentary or not, or you're interested in writing about a docudrama, which is kind of this hybrid of a documentary and a fiction film. I think it's really a fiction film, but I'm happy if you want to pursue that in your analysis. Please reach out and let's have some conversation. But I look forward to the conversation here, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care.